Are we live? It's a live broadcast, we got 3 women bosses. Courageous conversation in EdTech is awesome. Telling you to speak your truth, there might not be closure. A little something Glenn Singleton probably told you. Dr. Winokur's the diva with the knowledge. Victoria Thompson, that tech life, she's all about it. Nearpod, FlowCab, Flipgrid, Microsoft. Book creator, Bunsey, it's kinda hard to say them all. Last but not least, we got Melody McAllister, talking pedagogy in the classroom, so turn it up. You're in tune to the best thing going down. Ladies, are you ready? Tell us what we need to know about. Schools, no doubt, is in session. Take home lessons, count your blessing. Thanks to them, it's less guessing. There's no question, these ladies got respect. Courageous conversations in EdTech. Out.
Hello, everybody. How are you today? Welcome.
Yes, I love that intro. Every time it comes on, I get so happy.
Yes.
It's great.
Me too. But hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us. My name is Melody McAllister. I'm a mother, educator, author, blogger, consultant for a few of my jobs, and I'm so excited to be here with my co-hosts, Victoria Thompson and Dr. Eileen Winker. If you are just tuning in for the first time, we're so glad you're here. You can check out our previous episodes at bit.ly/MJMcAllieWrites, and I'll put that on the ticker very soon. We want you to check them out as they will help you understand that what our whole mission is about and how important it is to vet resources so curriculum does not cause trauma to any of our students, but especially for those who have been historically marginalized. We want to share a platform with educators and EdTech companies who have a mission of ensuring equity and anti-racist practices in the classroom and school communities in which they serve. Our last episodes have been focused on individuals and the EdTech companies they serve who have made equity and anti-racism a priority in their practices, products, and services. Tonight, we will feature EdTech leaders Ken Shelton, Holly Clark, and Alice Keeler, who are known internationally and their personal journeys of embracing anti-racist practices and how that has changed them personally and professionally. Like Dr. Winokur, Victoria, and myself, as we represent different paths in growing in anti-racism, so do our guests. Exposing vulnerability takes exceptional courage and opens them up for criticism of being too much or not enough in their professional and personal roles. This is not for us to judge, but to honor everyone in their journey and willingness to share, learn, and grow as they represent those who are listening in. We want to give credit to Glenn Singleton and his book, Courageous Conversations About Race, a field guide for achieving equity in schools, for the norms that we follow so that we can facilitate productive conversations that grow us. But we are not affiliated with him, and neither are our guests, and we don't make any profit from these conversations. So thank you again for joining us today. We hope at our closing that you are going to feel more empowered as an anti-racist educator and human. And no, we're gonna experience some technical difficulties. We just run through them and keep going. And now I would like to introduce my co-host, Victoria Thompson. Victoria, can you share about your background and mission as an educator, human, and your various professional roles?
Yeah, of course. Well, first I'm going to introduce Ren because he decided that he wants to be part of the podcast today. So this is Ren, everybody. And I guess he's just going to hang out on my lap. But I'm an educator. I'm an author. I'm an EdTech consultant. I'm a blogger. I do a lot of different things. I'm specifically a STEM coach. That is my day job. And then I'm also a professional learning specialist for NCCE, which is Northwestern Council for Computer Education. A lot of what I do with my work with educational technology and also in schools always has an anti-racism and equity lens, which means that I'm trying to ensure that all of our kids get all of the opportunities without being marginalized at the same time. I'm finding that in a lot of spaces, that is a very huge issue. So it's important to bring these to light, even if the conversations are uncomfortable, they do need to happen. I'm really excited for tonight's conversation because we've got 3 folks, of course, that are in various stages of their learning and they're willing to share and also grow and just learn from each other, which is always a good thing. You know, having a collaborative community of folks who are willing to speak and also just kind of be there as a presence is always fantastic. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it to Dr. Eileen Winokur so she can introduce herself.
Thank you so much, Victoria and Ren. I'm Eileen Winker, and I've lived in Kuwait since 1984. I'm a professional development specialist supporting teachers globally, including refugee teachers. Prior to retiring in 2019, I was a teacher and administrator for 25 years. My blog, podcast, and upcoming book focus on the importance of feeling a sense of belonging. I'm an ally, an advocate, and I'm constantly learning, especially from all of our guests, and open to change based on what I learn. And I'd like to go through those guidelines, those norms from Glenn Singleton, as Melody mentioned at the beginning in her introduction. There are 4 agreements that we follow to make sure that these conversations are productive and that we all learn from each other. The first one is to stay engaged. And staying engaged means that we need to be part of the conversation. And sometimes we may find that something is said that makes us feel like we want to shut down, but we want to stay engaged because it's really important in order to further the conversation. So we don't want to shut down. We are probably going to experience discomfort because these type of conversations often make us uncomfortable, but that's okay. In order for us to change, for us to be able to be part of these conversations, we sometimes do experience discomfort, but that's what makes us grow. We want to make sure that everybody feels they're in a safe environment to speak their truth. And we each speak our truth. We each come from different perspectives. And as Victoria and Mel both said at the beginning, we're all in different parts of the journey. The most important thing is that we're on this journey and we're on it together. So we want to continue to speak our truth. And as it develops, that truth may change slightly. We also realize that because these are uncomfortable conversations and we don't all agree, that sometimes we need to expect and accept non-closure, meaning that we may walk away from the conversation and things are still unresolved. But that's okay because it's a journey and we're not stopping here. We will continue these conversations personally and professionally. And so I'm really excited to turn it back over to Victoria and Mel as they introduce our guests today. I'm so excited to meet them.
Yeah, awesome. Melody, do you have anything to add before we do first question and we get to introduce our first guest?
I am ready to go when y'all are.
All right.
I have everything.
All right, so we are going to introduce they're all very special friends, but I was speaking with him this morning and I'm just really jazzed for him to be here. Ken Shelton. Yay! Hi, Ken. Why don't you introduce yourself a little bit?
Perfect. Thank you all for having me here. And I love the fact that you're citing Glenn Singleton, his book, The Protocols. I think the protocols are fantastic. I actually, in a lot of the anti-bias and anti-racist workshops I lead, I recommend incorporating those protocols in all of our dialogue, period. I think it is, knowing his educational background, I think it's important to consider the effectiveness of staying engaged socially, morally, intellectually, and cognitively, if you will. Accepting spec non-closure, speak your truth, all of those things. I think it's important to recognize the value of engaging in conversations with those protocols, period, but especially with this. So for anyone on the call or who's watching that doesn't know me, my name's Ken Shelton. I'm a Los Angeles-based educator. I taught in the classroom in the Los Angeles Unified School District for 18 years. And I pretty much now do advising, consulting, strategizing, speaking, and training for schools, school districts, and educators, both in the U.S. and outside of the U.S. So geography is not a barrier for me. Most of the work that I do is around either educational technology or the very nature of our conversation, which is anti-bias and anti-racism. But I always look at that as an overarching topic of what I call learning culture, which coincidentally is the basis of the book that I'm working on right now, which focuses on learning culture.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thank you so much. So the first question, because we're going to kind of introduce folks and then ask the question and then keep going. And I know you and I have had multiple conversations about this. Why is anti-racist education important to you?
So a couple of things. One, going back to the protocols, part of how racism and ultimately, and I guess it's important for anyone not knowing, how do you define racism, which to me is very similar to the way Dr. Kendi defines it, which is anything that either acknowledges, upholds, or maintains a racial hierarchy. So that's just literally that simplistic. So even with the protocols that you all share with Glenn Singleton, one of the things that I have found, especially in my career as an educator, as well as my time as a student, not limited to my K-12 experience, is the denial of my existence by way of me not being able to speak my truth. Right. And so I think that when you approach the work, and for me, why is anti-racist education important? Because there's so many ways that education systemically upholds a racial hierarchy, whether it's the representations in the books that we read, the way history is told, and how many narratives and many voices are either intentionally omitted or pushed to the margins, the way our structures are set up that I can predict who's going to be successful and who is not going to be successful, the constant gaslighting in education around things like the only way you'll succeed is if you work hard, which upholds a myth of meritocracy. So for me, it is really the whole idea around anti-racist in education is twofold. It's the empowerment and liberation of those that don't realize that they are participating in a racist system. And for those like me who realize that part of my being able to realize my full potential is to dismantle the things in that racist system that have pushed me to the margins or have oppressed my voice and even in some cases my history.
Word. Well said. Awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah. Every time we talk to you, it's just ever. All right. So now we're going to be introducing our next guest, which is Holly Clark. Yay.
Hi, everyone.
How are you?
I'm so excited to be here, actually, and loved listening to what Ken said.
Yes, we're excited to have you here. So why don't you introduce yourself a little bit? That way, if folks are listening, they can figure out who you are.
So I am the author of the Chromebook Infused Classroom, the Google Infused Classroom, the Microsoft Infused Classroom. I run kind of the Infused Classroom, I guess you could just call it series and PD. And I really talk about how we need to understand how the digital pedagogies can help kids be ready for their future, but also bring in that equitable part as well, because we can hear more stories and we can hear from more people if we're using all of those things that we have online.
Yeah, awesome. So back to that question. So what does anti-racist education mean to you? / why is being an anti-racist educator important to you?
Well, it's really important to me for many reasons, but I want to step back to the first time that I was in a classroom, and it was a long time ago, 1996 or 1997, and I walked into a classroom where no one looked like me. And all of the standards that I had to accomplish and all of the things that I had to do were based in like Emily Dickinson. And I looked around and I was thinking to myself, no one here, this isn't what I need to teach. And so I was told that year that my kids had the second lowest writing scores in the district. And outside, and it was around the time of Sister Act, and there's like a thing I do in my keynote where there's Lauryn Hill sitting there and she's doing all these raps and people are coming in and they're doing, I guess they're called riffs and coming in and out. And then my kids were doing that out in the yard. And I thought to myself, you guys are telling me these kids can't write? Do you hear them? They can write. You're assessing their writing incorrectly. Mm-hmm. They can do metaphors. They can do all of these things. So I sat down with these kids and I didn't even know what I was doing. And I looked at where their strengths were. And I looked at what things that I could build on that we could work with. And that was my like first kind of dipping my toes into something like this. And that year, they had the second lowest scores in the district. And by the time we were done focusing on their strengths, they had the second highest. And so it was that made me say, you know what, we need to not look at kids for what they can't do. And doesn't matter what race or who they are, but look at what they can do. And that will bring us equity. And then I looked at the stories I was being told I had to tell in history. And I just gotten done with college and read Howard Zinn. And I'm like, why am I not bringing Howard Zinn in here? Why am I having to teach these stories? And so those are the reasons why I'm passionate about it and why I think it's really important, because kids need to hear stories that reflect them. And that was a big change.
Yeah.
In fact, I never used the textbook again.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I ever used it.
I love that you, one, recognize those strengths, and then two, were able to realize that this is kind of like a byproduct of just all of the nonsense that goes on in schools, right? Like I feel the same with academic writing, rooted in a lot of supremacy, rooted in a lot of, well, this is the way it's always done. Looking at how your students are and who they are and loving them unconditionally, right? That's how we kind of begin that pathway to liberation. And that's how we really begin to think about our students' strengths and also what they can do.
And if I can say one other thing, and this is very transparent and vulnerable of me, but I come from a family who doesn't understand systematic racism. And so I know what that sounds like. And I know what needs to happen in classrooms that reflect what I look like. Because if the stories aren't there and people aren't understanding, we're going to have the same sort of dialogue that I heard this every once in a while. I go to Fox News just to see what they're saying. And I heard Brett Hume saying just the other day, we're the least racist country in the world. And I was like, this is why we have to change stuff.
Yep.
Anyway, sorry.
Absolutely. It's so hard, right? Because when we are doing this type of work, but then when there are folks that don't recognize that it's a thing, it just makes it that much harder. It really does.
And it's as important in classrooms that look differently than the first class I was talking about, as in classrooms where everyone looks like me. It's as important everywhere that these voices are heard and shared, and we're not just reading F. Scott Fitzgerald all day long.
Right. Exactly. Absolutely. Mel?
Sorry. So Ken is sharing all these things private, and I'm trying to can you talk about them though? They're just too good for you to not talk about. I'll put them up, but do you mind going into it a little bit more deeply?
I don't at all. I know we have another guest, so if you want, I can share it now, or I can just share them in within the context of our dialogue, because Holly and I talk all the time about what we're discussing here, and I just, again, things I'm including in the book. I took the red pill, metaphorical representation, and I see the whole thing for what it is. And I guess for the audience, I mean, what you see a lot, again, is the fact that a lot of folks, even to Holly's story, it's a good story, but my caution is a lot of teachers will resort to a gaslighting tactic called spiritual bypass, which means that we'll just love and light it away. And a lot of editors say, well, I love my children. That's great. But if you're still operating within a colonized structure, if you're still, for example, one of the things I challenge a bunch of school leaders that I worked with a couple of weeks ago is I literally had all of them send me the student handbook and from all their schools. There were 3 times as many pages dedicated to punitive and disciplinary actions as there were to restorative and supportive action. And so the whole idea around, well, I love all of my kids. That's great, but you still are coloring in the lines. What you have to look at is how is the system designed, and how might I be not only a disruptor within that system, but do it in a way that is empowering, uplifting, and liberating. And sometimes, yes, to Holly's point, which I brought up, it is in the books, but I'll give you all an example. One school district, they mandate teaching To Kill a Mockingbird. Okay.
Almost all school districts do that.
Now, here's my thing. Here's something that might surprise you all. I'm actually not for banning those books, believe it or not. What I am for is, if you're going to teach To Kill a Mockingbird, then you better have a paired text with it.
Right.
So for example, The Hate You Give. And then now engage in dialogue with students. First of all, ensure that it is a safe learning environment. So for me, if I'm in that learning environment, one, none of the emotional capital or intellectual capital should be offloaded to me as being the black student, for one.
Yep.
Number two, it's the time period. Okay, so this was written by a white author who grew up in Monroeville, Alabama, and wrote about this. This was written by a black female author, and then what's Angie Thomas's background? We're going to look at this one. We're going to look at this one. Now, how do we critically analyze the messaging within these time period pieces? Whose voices are represented in one versus the other? How are they represented in one versus the other? Who has agency in one versus who does in the other? And again, the whole idea here is, and this is where I think in education, people really need to take a step back and really analyze why exactly is it you're so vehemently defending something, when my whole thing is, how do you truly develop critical thinkers? You expose them to the whole story, and then you encourage analytical thought around that.
Right.
So that was why one of the things I shared is the whole idea around the spiritual bypass. It's very easy to say, well, I just love all my students. Yeah, that's gaslighting, because what you're doing is you're basically saying, if I just love you, then that'll make it all go away. And you're not looking at some of the systems and the institutionalized things that exist, that no matter how much you love your students, they still can be exposed to a disproportionate degree of disciplinary action. The suspension and expulsion rates still are disproportionately high amongst Black male and Latino students. You still are grading under a colonized structure. You still are stratifying. I mean, all those things. Yeah, you love your students, it's great, but you got to be able to analyze all those other elements as well. So
there's love, and then there's unconditional love. The love is the gaslighting. The unconditional love is, okay, now I need to unlearn. I need to think critically. I have to think about systems. I have to question myself. I have to learn, right? So when I see an educator, that's cool, right? But that's not what we need, right? We have to think about the systems that our students are being put in. And that's, Holly, I think what you were doing as well. You know, just kind of being like, they're being graded on something that doesn't make sense, right?
And they can write.
Right, yeah, right. They can write. They might not be in this colonized way that the system wanted them to produce.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I had educators say to me, well, I don't see I don't see color here. This isn't about and I was
that's just as damaging. Color blindness is another type of gaslighting. It is a detour from doing the work. You should see color. You should see gender identity. You should see all those things, because the minute you say that you don't see something, if that is aligned with my cultural identity, then you don't see me.
Right. And that's what I hear whenever people say I don't see color. I'm like, well, then you don't see me. You know?
It's not a bad thing.
Yeah.
I mean, ultimately, our identity is again, there's the identity that we embody for ourselves, and there's that has been forced upon us by social conditions. Race is socially constructed. So I laugh when, well, what does it mean to be white? I'm like, shouldn't mean anything to you because it's socially constructed. What are you as an individual? What are your thoughts? What are your beliefs? What are your loves? What are your dreams? That's what's important. The minute you enter race into the conversation, you have accepted that this socially constructed condition is necessary for what is shot: stratification, subjugation, oppression, and marginalization.
Right.
I even saw, just on a side note, someone posted on Twitter the other day where, I think it was yesterday, where a presenter was referring to a group of students saying, guys and girls and you guys, and then asked the question when a student said, not all of us are boys and girls, and then asked the question, was that disrespectful? And I'm like, not only was it not, I'm glad that student spoke up, because you see, if you, again, the language, if you are referring to a group in a gender binary, then there may be someone in that group who is not seen. And to me, it's like, you need to adopt inclusive language. That's a simple example of when addressing a whole group.
Yep, it's all about inclusion. All about inclusion. All right. Speaking of inclusion, let's include our next one. Like that segue, y'all? Y'all is also something I use for inclusion. So I don't use you guys, and that's been really hard for me being from New Jersey, right? Like we always say you guys or da-da-da-da. I say y'all. But y'all are going to be really excited to meet our next guest, who is Alice Keeler. Hey, Alice.
Thanks for having me. I was perfectly happy. I've been just taking notes. I was asked, do you want to hang out with Victoria and Holly and, of course, Ken, who he and I have been longtime friends, and I could just listen to him forever. So that's what I'm here for, is hearing these things. The more I hear it, I mean, there's things that are just so normalized that you don't think about it. You have these phrases and catchphrases, and I know a lot of really good people who even this week I've heard say, I don't see color. What's wrong with that? Mm-hmm. And I don't have a good rebuttal. I mean, I know that you don't say that, but more so is I just need to hear these conversations more often. And so if I could just reread some of the things that I wrote down, is that right?
Yeah, sure.
Defining racism, if you asked me to define that, I think I would stumble. So I appreciate that from Ken, right? Acknowledging racism acknowledges or upholds a racial hierarchy. And so, if I could read my own handwriting, that would probably be the best. Ken, you're like on fire. And I'm like, I can't write this so fast enough. What we had, that doesn't make any sense. Education upholds a racial hierarchy that predicts who will succeed. And then just by working hard, and we're saying, look, if you fit in our box, we'll keep you around here. But if not, let's put you somewhere else. And I've always taught the students who are not successful at math. And this is my own thing that I wrote down. In math, we define what makes someone good at math. And I get so offended. I hear all the time, I'm not good at math. And it's like, we just define that for you. And it's a lie. It's of course you're a good writer. Like I have a student right now, he just constantly codes in Scratch. And an email went out that said, this is a problem. We can't let this kid use the computer. He's just coding all the time. And I'm like, are you joking? Why don't we let's redefine what success looks for this kid. So I heard, and the grading is like my hot button. I don't understand why we continue this archaic system. So grading under a colonized structure is really true. And then when Holly says she doesn't use the textbook anymore, I've just been so frustrated using this textbook this year. Right. One of my key examples that I give out of this is there's a round ice rink. Round ice rink. First of all, those don't exist. Melody would know. She lives in Alaska. And then on top of that, like I'm in Southwest Kansas. How many ice rinks are there? What kind of cultural experiences are we doing that's really relatable to kids and the students that we have? And the textbook doesn't know your kids. I think that's the real big problem, is whoever wrote this doesn't know the kid in front of you. Exactly. That's where I find a lot of my frustration. And a lot of people just don't recognize that racism is a thing. I hear that a lot. Victoria said that. Thank you. Right. Mm-hmm. It's important to be here for me so that I can hear more, and I put myself in positions where I hear people saying things that I can listen to and try to understand how I can rebut things like that. Because I hear that a lot. So, we have to question ourselves. Is that what students need? Victoria said this, right? Think about the systems that they're put in. And again, with the I don't see color. Thank you, Ken. Colorblindness is another type of gaslighting. And so nothing that really spoke out to me was, is it disrespectful to speak up? Mm-hmm. I hear a lot of that, the kids being disrespectful. They're disrespectful. It's like, we teach kids not to speak up for themselves, to not stand up for themselves. And to me, that's the biggest problem, is not having a student voice for students and feeling that, our experiences, this is how I was taught, this is how I did it. It's hard to break out of that. When I grew up, it was disrespectful to say something back. In fact, my mom, she says that when she was a kid, her name is Carrie, Carrie, and she had a teacher correct her and says, when it's spelled this way, it should be pronounced Kari. And it was disrespectful to correct the teacher on how to say your name. But of course, to me, that's the ultimate disrespect, is not respecting what someone wants to be called. And so adopting that inclusive language and being willing to change phrases that you've always said, that is unbelievably hard. I took in a young lady who is trans, and to try and let go of he and she, it's hard. And you just have to be willing to say you're important enough. And so, anyway, I have a lot more notes, but I'm Alice. I'm a mom of 5 and I teach math.
Yeah. You touched on this a little bit, Alice, and in the private chat, Mel, if you want to push it out, misbehavior or misinterpretation. This is one of my favorite resources that basically just talks about, is it an actual misbehavior, or are we misinterpreting maybe something that a student might want to say? Maybe the communication is just lost in translation somewhere. Behavior reveals a lot, but it also reveals a lot that sometimes we do not know. And also that people might not want to communicate to us, right? So you're more than welcome to push that out, but it's one of my favorites that talks about what Alice was speaking about, right? Like, are they really acting out, or is there a communication that we need to take care of? And it's that lack of that cultural competence too, because you can't be culturally responsive if you don't know the culture. I see so much culturally responsive this, culturally responsive that. If you don't know the culture of your kids, then you can't be culturally responsive. But anyway, I'll shut up and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Eileen for question number 2.
Sounds good. So I think all three of you have started to tell us about your journeys and the kinds of things that you're doing to ensure that you're anti-racist. But maybe for those who are watching and listening, because I've seen some of the comments that Mel has put up, that people are really trying to get on this journey with us. And so what kind of steps could you advise for them to start with? We've already said in previous conversations, they don't need to be big steps. Baby steps is a place to start. So I don't know who wants to start. Ken, do you want to sort of judge? Yeah, go ahead, Holly.
Yeah, Holly, go ahead.
I just want to say something before we start this conversation. I personally, and this is all about Holly, I have a problem with the word woke. Because a lot of people are trying to get towards being woke, or, you can get a Bitmoji that says woke, whatever. I don't believe as a white person, for me, Holly Clark, that I can ever be woke. It is a constant journey that I have to go on. I have to read. I have to have friends of different colors, or I cannot understand what I need to understand. And that's one of the first things that needs to happen. If you have a Facebook full of people, go look at them, and there are no people of color that are your friends. And that's being nice. That's me giving you Facebook friends in this thing. You can't grow and you can't understand. And I really wish we would take out the word woke, because I'm never going to be woke.
Right. And it's totally overused. And again, it's a way for us to sort of say that we're on this journey, but then we're not really. So Ken, I think you wanted to also hop in on this question or talk about what, respond to Holly.
Yeah.
So I agree with Holly. I don't think there's such thing as being woke. I think there is a recognition that it's a learning process, and that and I always say in my workshops, it's a marathon, not a sprint. And
right.
I got news for you. There technically is no finish line. And I actually challenge educators that, you ask a group of educators, how many of you identify yourselves as lifelong learners? And rarely do you not see a hand go up. And I say, well, this is lifelong learning. And so if you adopt, which maybe we'll say for another conversation, which Victoria and I have talked about how I feel about the weaponization of the phrase growth mindset. But if you, that's a whole, going back to the very first question, that is a way that kids that look like me are gaslit every day. Oh, you just need to have a growth mindset. Really? In my under-resourced and over-exploited school, that you gauge my learning, to Holly's point. In fact, I did this with a school district where they had identified a subgroup demographic as being 2 grade levels below in their reading scores. And I'm like, okay, let's take a step back. How are the reading scores assessed? What's being assigned? And how much you want to bet that the students are not, the mirrors and windows, sliding glass doors. Their reading doesn't serve as a mirror. So I can't even connect to the context of what I'm reading. So it might not be a function of me not understanding it. It's a function of I can't connect to it to therefore show you or represent that I actually am understanding and comprehending what I'm reading in the first place. So with that being said, for me to be more informed is twofold. And then even to Holly's point, and even Caripple, grit. Again, save for another recording on, I could do a whole hour's talk on all the ways in which educators themselves, and even in some cases not aware, how we're constantly gaslighting each other with these buzzwords and these terms with no context and no understanding of the nuance that should occur within them. But to Holly's point, one of the things I always challenge educators, and I'll share with you all what I do for myself, is first, look at your PLN.
Yep.
That's the start. Okay.
Perfect.
Now, when you think in terms of who you learn with, who you learn from, and how you connect to folks, how diverse is your group? How many true, then I'm going to say that, how many true Black friends do you have? How many true friends do you have that their identity is aligned with the LGBTQ plus community? If they're not true friends, then you're not learning from others. You're not gaining a valuable understanding of their experience. And no, it's not the performative thing of, well, I'm going to go and find a friend. There has to be an authenticity and legitimacy to it. Now, as far as me being informed, I mean, I read and read and read. I haven't been able to maintain it this year, but I read a book a week for the most part, and I listen to podcasts. I have my own podcast with my boy D. Lanier. She's actually a regular guest on it, friend of the pod.
Oh, okay.
But I think ultimately the main thing for me and even for everyone watching is, how are you exposing yourself to learning opportunities that are outside what is normalized for you? If you're relying on social media, the algorithms of oppression, you need to start connecting with educators who don't say the same thing that you do and don't look like you. Otherwise, all those algorithms, they're automation of the status quo. They're going to keep feeding you what you want to hear. And you've got to tweak that algorithm every once in a while to make sure that you're getting multiple perspectives. The main thing for educators for me is that, getting a different perspective doesn't necessarily change your mind. It just broadens your understanding of the lived experience of someone who isn't you.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. I so agree with all of that. There is this idea that we don't step back and reflect and take a look at who we're surrounded by. And if we don't have these uncomfortable conversations where we do experience discomfort and sometimes may feel like we want to disengage, we need to engage. That's the only way that we learn. And I have had a problem with education buzzwords for a really long time. I joke that we should have a big conference or summit where all the stakeholders get together and we define all of these buzzwords and make a decision finally about what they really mean, because they're so misinterpreted. And it's a problem when we have it affect our students in a negative way, as it is. So Alice, do you want to sort of hop in here with your observations about what you're hearing, or your thoughts about what steps you're taking, or you advise others that might be able to get started on their journey? You're on mute.
I think you're on mute.
Yes, I probably am, because I'm listening to Ken, which is always awesome. My first step is not being defensive. I think a lot of times we're telling people, don't say this, don't say that, and then it's what you've always heard, and you feel like you're a good person. And of course, why wouldn't I just say I love everybody? And so just wanting to just start with saying I'm going to listen, which is where I am at. Caring about others, is not about criticizing. I just want to hear from different voices, right? It's like, who is in my sphere? And then that's something that I will say with people that I'm close to. Sometimes I'm like, who are you getting information from? Who tells you that? And I feel really sad as how many people I encounter who feel not just that they're anti-Black Lives Matter, but that they're angry. It's like, where do you get this anger from? Why are you angry about it? It's not hard to understand that somebody says something's not right. Why, as a Christian, would you not want to feel someone who says, I feel hurt? And so just not starting by being defensive, like, what do you mean you're wearing this shirt? And you're like, how about I hear that you're saying something's not right? And you don't have to understand necessarily, but just starting from a place of being willing to listen. I think I like the phrase that Ken said, the weaponization of the phrase growth mindset, as maybe the world's biggest Joe Bowler fan who wrote the book Mathematical Mindsets, and they have growth mindset. I will completely agree with Ken that has been bastardized for a lot of people as just a tool to say, well, you're not good at this, or you're not getting it, not because we're not willing to change the systems or what helps you be successful, but you just don't have a good enough attitude. And that's not what a growth mindset means at all. And I really particularly enjoyed the how are we being assessed. And I was I'm in Kansas right now, and we had the Kansas state test, and I won't say what's on it because of course that's not legal, but I just was so sad to see that that's what the state of Kansas thought was valuable. So when we say the students are low or they're not performing, I'm like, well, that's not what I valued this whole year, and I'm sad that this is what we value for kids to be able to perform at. Are they low? Well, not by measure of that test and by the way that we grade, and we include behavior and how respectful kids are in that grade. And I think that's something that we could relook at. So who's in your PLN? Who do you learn with? How diverse is your group? And get outside of what's normalized for you. If you don't hear opposing opinions and not get defensive about it, that would be my challenge.
Yeah. Totally.
I love what you're saying, Alice, because you're sort of a mirror to others that you hold up and give them a chance to pause for just a second by the questions that you ask them. Why are you so angry? Why do you feel this way? And so not only are you on this journey with listening more, but you're also involving others that you hear need to join you on this journey. And Ken mentioned in one of the comments that Mel put up about this is really, the solidarity is really, really important to this whole being able to change the system. And so I love the fact that we have people on different parts of the journey and people who want to join us on the journey. And the more people we're able to add to be on this journey, the better we will all be in the future. And so I mean, this whole conversation has me so pumped, so excited. So
going back to Victoria too, with the solidarity, right? So like for me, the opposite of woke is asleep, right? That's like the literal opposite. So to say that you're woke or to say that somebody is woke, it means like how Holly said, that they're not really interested in learning more. That solidarity comes from learning. And that solidarity comes from learning more. And always, like how Ken said, making this a continuous process, right? You don't just go to sleep and then wake up one day and you're cured, right? And you know all the knowledge and you have all the tools. This is a continuous process. And I think that really that is where the solidarity comes from. So speaking of solidarity, the next question is a bit of a sticky wicket, but when we do this type of work with anti-racism and also just with speaking our truth, it can impact our careers. And it's definitely impacted mine. I've had folks that refuse to work with me because I'm too blunt or I point things out and blah, blah, blah. And it's hard. So has this impacted your career? You can not answer. You can answer as broad as you want. It's completely up to you, either for better or for worse, right? How has, and I need you to stop growling because there's nobody outside. How has this impacted your career?
Well, I'll just start in that if it hasn't impacted your teaching, then maybe that's the conversation to really have is you're not pushing enough to say something's not right. We're not being equitable for our students. If you believe that kids should have equitable opportunities, then you also need to be looking for where they're not.
I will say I've almost been fired from schools because I wouldn't teach from the textbook. And I've left the school in Chicago because they said it's one or the other. And I can't teach only white stories about the white person doing all these great things. And so I made a really hard decision and said, I'll go this year because I can't do it. So that's how it affected. But that was like the best decision ever, as they all are, right? But I've gotten myself in a lot of trouble. But it's trouble I'm willing to get into. Good trouble, I guess.
Good trouble, yeah. Good trouble.
Okay, I'm unmuted. So I'm going to talk about how it's impacted my career and some of the challenges I face now. It impacted my career in several ways. So one, this is part of the reason why I'm no longer in the classroom. I still think there is an absurdly and offensively low volume or percentage of black male educators in classrooms. Mm-hmm. And so I know what it's like working in isolation, being the only one at every school. And this is where, so Victoria, I'm going to reveal a little something of a conversation you and I have had that I think is important for this broadcast.
Yeah.
If you look at the general demographic of speakers at conferences, we all know on this call what the representation generally is. Right. And so the reason why I say that is not an indictment necessarily on an individual, but when I hear the things around be the disruptor, be the squeaky wheel, be the voice, be all these things, what I'm also hearing is you aren't recognizing your privilege. You aren't recognizing how your mediocrity has been rewarded, which is why you're on stage. And then further to that point, how irresponsible is it for you to encourage educators to use their voice and to do that, not knowing that use of that voice could actually be you putting a target on your back. And I know this because that was me. Now, my whole point with that is why I always encourage educators, know the context and the culture of the environments you work within. And when you recognize things that are problematic, do things that can either assert more power and more agency for your student or dismantle some of the things that are identifiable as oppressive or subjugation. Do it to the degree that you don't cause yourself to have to leave the profession, because we still need more of those voices, and know that you're not in it alone. As far as my challenges go, there's the things where, I've literally been told recently, oh, you're too radical, you're too aggressive. I'm like, it's only radical if it's an idea that you haven't been exposed to.
Right.
And so therefore, is it truly radical to think, maybe some things I've done require additional examination, additional thought, and additional growth? And so what happens is there's this desperate grasp to maintain the status quo, in some cases through complacency. It's what I call the pacification of PD. And then you just resort to what's radical. It's too radical. What would happen if I'm a student in class and I say, teaching me, because Holly mentioned like F. Scott Fitzgerald, teaching me The Great Gatsby is too radical. That's not aligned with something that my experiences of me growing up. Why do I have to read that? I'm not going to read it. What will usually happen? So my whole thing now, to be honest, is it's my voice. I've spent my entire adult life up until recently having to either silence my own thinking or silence my own thoughts, or constantly being told in varying ways, know your place, which is you're too aggressive, you're outspoken, you're this, that, the other. It's my voice. I'm going to use it. And I recognize that for some folks, you don't want to hear it. And for others, you do. Those that do and say, you know what? You've exposed me to something that I hadn't thought of before. My response is always, perfect. Now, how can we work on it side by side together? Because ultimately, it's not about me. It's about us as educators, and it's about us as education as an institution, that ultimately, how do we uplift each other and do it in ways where many of us are not on the same growth path. It's why I begin every workshop I do with one of my favorite poems. It's called An Invitation to a Brave Space. I've been in situations where safe space has been weaponized. And so the whole point there, and that's why I go back to the comment that Melanie shared, is the whole idea around solidarity. Yeah, I recognize there's some educators that are like, I'm just now starting off. Great. Tell me where you are, where you want to be, and how can I be an added resource, advocate, and even some cases a cheerleader to support your growth. Because ultimately, my success is your success is our success. And how do we measure it? I measure it. What's happening in the classroom? What is the student experience?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so important. Now, I've been thinking, because I'm here in Kuwait, and of course, it's a different type of colonization here in the Middle East and this area of the world, this part of the world. And I think of the lack of language and the lack of English language, and also the idea or the perception that the West has the solutions. Right. And we need to look to the West in order to come up with the solutions. And so there is a huge problem with thinking that the minority are the ones that are going to solve. And I think it's just recently that this region has understood that in order to be able to solve our problems, we need people from within the community to contextualize, and I know that several of you have mentioned the context. So what context are we talking about, and how can we make sure that the voices who speak from that context are empowered, feel empowered? That includes our students, from how we pronounce their names, and also, what Ken was talking about, and I think Holly and Alice also, about students being able to feel that they can speak up without being told they're being disrespectful. And
Right.
that's, to me, is a teachable moment. If they are truly being disrespectful and not pointing out something that needed to be pointed out, then we take that teachable moment and allow them to speak. We don't shut them down because we tell them because we're uncomfortable. And that's why I go back to Glenn Singleton's protocols, because again, if it makes us as teachers or as people uncomfortable, that's part of the learning process, right?
Yep. In the uncomfort is where we find things that we need to find out about ourselves, and also things that we need to address. And if some injustice happens and if we don't feel uncomfortable, then to me, when I look at that, I'm like, that's a problem, right? That's a problem. And I think we can all in the rooms, in the virtual room, right, speak to that, where if an injustice happens and if somebody's okay with it, we sit and we're just thinking, why was that person not okay, right? Did I speak up? Did I say enough? What happened where maybe I could have intercepted? And there are spaces where we're not there, and it's kind of like he said, she said, or she said, or they said, like we don't know what happened. But in the instances where we are there, I'd like to think that we'd all have the opportunity to speak up and do what's right, because that's important. It's not just important for us, for our personal growth, but especially for the kids, because that's what it's all about. If we have good teachers, then we have good kids, for the most part.
Yeah.
99% of the time. Yeah.
Absolutely. There's a book that I'm reading right now. I think this is the American title, because the title is different in Britain and in the United States, but it's by Emma DeBerry, and it's called Twisted. And for those of you, if you haven't read it, I haven't finished it yet, but it is really eye-opening to how African hair is really the problem for us and what we see, and not necessarily color. And obviously they work together, but just her perception. And then she goes back and she talks research-wise and about colonialism. And I'm not doing her book justice at all, so please pick up the book and read it, because it gives us a different perspective completely on the origins of all of this. And I know, the Black Lives Matter movement has spoken about what happened before slavery. We need to go back and really look at the past history about what happened way before slavery and what was happening in Africa and other parts of the world, in terms of what our perceptions are. It's really an eye opener so far since I've started reading it.
Mel, I just dropped in the chat because I know we've been talking a little bit too about just unhealthy policing in schools. There was a really good NPR 7-minute listen on the history of American policing and just kind of those origins. If anyone's interested, of course, you're more than welcome to read, listen, all that stuff. But, we talk so much about how a lot of this that happens in schools and also just period in our country happens from just unhealthy policing. So just the history of that, I think, gives some good context. So we have our very last question, which is sad because that means the podcast is about to end, but also happy because that means you get to come again, right? Because we always have an open invitation. But I'm just curious, and I know we all are too, specifically just with your current work, previous projects, upcoming projects, and just you being a human being. What is something that you've learned about yourself along the way just, when you started this journey to where you are now with all of the things that y'all are involved in, what is something that you've learned about yourself along the way?
Is that comfortable silence to wait for a response?
Yeah.
I'll go last.
Wait time, right? We got to do the wait time because we're all educators.
Is it okay if I start? I mean, anybody can answer this, right?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Something that I've realized that I'm learning along the way is just getting feedback. And sometimes the feedback that I'm getting isn't always just like, yay, Melody, you did a good job. Some of the feedback is, hey, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do this? Or why didn't you say this? Or why didn't you include these people? And learning how to take that upon myself and learn from it instead of getting defensive and shutting a person down or throwing in the towel and saying, well, I can't do this because I suck at it. Obviously, somebody criticized me. Is something that I'm learning, and I can do much better now than I used to be able to do. So that's what I'm learning. And I hope that if you're watching and this is part of your journey, because a lot of people are saying that this is super powerful. Tell us what you are more than welcome to share what you are also learning, and we'd love to hear it.
Yeah.
Holly, I think you were going to say something, yes?
Well, yes. I just 5 million things are going through my head at the same time. But I think in relation to what we're talking about, and I know you said this could be a bigger question, but I'm really learning about the voices in my head that are there from my childhood, and that I have to understand them as what they are. And that's why I'll never be woke, because I have to recognize them and stop them. Even though I'm I do the best I can, they're still there. And I think saying that they're still there is something a lot of people who look like me are not willing to do. And they need to be willing to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I say it all the time. That's the racist in me coming out, because I didn't grow up racist, but I grew up with some stuff that I have to fight through every day.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And, awareness is a really big step also.
Absolutely.
I'm not on mute, am I?
No,
Holly, I just want to say, I kind of chuckle at this, but it's terrible because we grew up where we're not supposed to talk about it. It's impolite, but it's we're polite racists, there's, what are we really? I mean, we have to identify that inside of ourselves. I've had to come to that conclusion that, yes, I have racist thoughts and I have biases and I've discriminated. I've had to be honest with myself. And I think that's always the first step that people have to acknowledge before that they can move on to anything else or even be effective in their teaching and being a good neighbor and friend to people. But it's hard to do that. And because we grow up thinking we're polite when we don't talk about it, but there's no such thing as a polite racist. I mean, the thing is that there's something lingering in all of us. We have to name it and we have to move and grow from that. And even though some of us are, more years down the road than others, and some of us have had to live with this every single day of our life. I mean, we still have work to do, and we have to acknowledge that. And like you, I would never say that I was woke, because I still have, I still have a journey ahead of me to be better and to do better.
Well, I've learned from my growing up that people who say they're not racist are the most racist.
Yep. I would probably, I would have to agree with that just based on my experience.
Yeah.
I'm not racist, but I'm not racist, but I'm not racist, but.
Yeah.
No,
we just have a couple of minutes left, I think. If Alice and Ken want to comment on that last question or about anything else that we've talked about.
I was wondering if we could get a rephrasing of the last question.
Sure.
Yeah.
Go ahead and rephrase it.
I feel like the phrase, what you've learned about yourself, says that you were fixed in a certain person at the beginning of existence, and then you're discovering yourself as opposed to constantly growing and changing. And I really just hope I'm just not the same person that I was before and say, well, this is who I am, as opposed to being open to being somebody that I want to be.
Yeah. That's an important rephrasing. I think it's important to look at. Ken?
Okay, so just a couple of things. One, to the point that Holly was sharing, I think it's important for the audience to recognize that you can actively participate in a racist institution or racist system and not yourself feel or engage in willful intent of being a racist. And I think that's one of the things, especially when it comes to education, that educators don't realize is they associate it with that it's a good bad binary, and that in order to be racist, it has to be willful and intentional. And that's where you get into the whole thing around, again, recognizing that just active participation in any system that acknowledges, maintains, and upholds a racial hierarchy is in fact being racist. And so for me, my main thing is before I go into what I've learned about myself, the first step I always tell educators is, one, you want to operate from a degree of where you don't necessarily feel guilt, because it's not fair to hold yourself accountable for something you didn't know of. My thing is, when you're introduced with new information, what are you doing with that? And it's why I always share the Maya Angelou quote, which, again, one of my heroes, that going back to Holly's story, I was never allowed, nor encouraged, nor offered the opportunity to read Maya Angelou in school, in K-12. Okay? Do the best you can until you know better. And when you know better, do better. So my whole thing is, when you have opportunities to expose yourself to different experiences, different narratives, different books, what I found, unfortunately, last June is a lot of educators were like, oh my God, this racism is a thing. What's a book I could read? And someone wrote a thing in, I think it was in a Huff Post, they're like, yeah, when black people experience pain, white people read a book. Like, that's a start, but there's more to it than just simply reading a book. It's like, interrogate your own thinking, interrogate your own actions. How am I upholding something and that I'm not even aware of it? And I think for me, what I've learned about myself along this whole way is that, like, honestly, real talk, I want my time back, because I have not been my whole true self for most of my adult life. And I want my time back, but I'm not going to get it back. I have more years behind me than I have ahead of me. So for me, again, it's recognition. It's what I would call a degree of personal liberation and personal reconciliation. This is who I am. I'm going to use my voice. My default is being supportive of educators. My default is being in a position to be an valuable asset, resource, and loving support of all of my friends, of which they're on this call. As Alice shared, I've been friends with Alice and Holly for more than 10 years. We're all different now, and that's a good thing. But there's also a reason why we're still friends.
Right.
Have I done problematic things? Absolutely. I think back to all the things I did early in my career where I was doing the things of blaming the individual without interrogating the system. I was the one who was like, here's a standardized test and we have to work hard. We have to do this. I did all that stuff. It doesn't make me a bad person, because I didn't know then what I know now. The difference is I had opportunities to learn and grow. And not only did I seek them, going back to the courageous conversations, I experienced the discomfort, I leaned into it, and now I know more, and now I can do better as a result of it. So for me, the whole idea is just how am I actively engaging in learning opportunities, whether it's books, podcasts, dialogue, anything, that I will continue to be a better version of myself as a result of my learning opportunities.
Yeah. For me, just really, really quickly, as you're all talking, and especially what Ken was just saying, I'm thinking to myself, I grew up during the civil rights era. I'm 65. There's a lot of unpacking I have to do as a result of that, because at that point we were so hopeful and there were so many things going on and there are so many perceptions that I had. I grew up with, we don't see color. In fact, my sister and I were having a conversation about it a couple of months ago. And then somebody called me on it on Twitter. And so I engaged in this dialogue and I realized, wait, that is a problem, because if I don't see color, just like y'all said at the beginning. And so there's that unpacking on top of my white privilege. And now on top of my privilege of being Kuwaiti here in Kuwait, which is privilege. And so, yeah, there's a lot of unpacking to do. So it's all a matter of listening, learning, and doing something about it when we do learn that new information. Mm-hmm. So I love that, Ken. That's awesome.
Absolutely.
Yeah. This was amazing. Oh my gosh. Can we just keep talking?
Yeah, Ken, I muted myself. Ken, don't just say that out loud. Say it out loud. What you wrote in our private chat about educators.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's a recognition of privilege. So Dr. Winokur mentioned the whole idea around recognizing my privilege. Listen, all of us benefit from privilege. And I think that part of it is acknowledging what privilege is and what we benefit from. So I'll give you all an example. I benefit from the following privileges. I'm a cisgender hetero male. My first language is English. I'm able-bodied. I'm what's identified as neurotypical. Mm-hmm. Okay, those are privileges I have. Those are privileges that I have that aren't a result of something I've done. Now, what are some of the socially constructed privileges I have? I have a master's degree. So there's an automatic assumption that I'm smarter than someone who doesn't. Okay, so me knowing those things means that when I enter a space of which somebody doesn't have the same cultural identity as me, doesn't have those same privileges, I now, thankfully, and it's still a work in progress, but I'm now more mindful of things like using non-gender binary language when I address a group. Okay, so the main thing there is that what usually happens in dialogue I've had with educators, and it's no fault of their own, but they're like, you know what, I grew up poor. I didn't have privilege. And I'm like, listen, privilege is not always absent of struggle.
Right.
What you have to recognize is that if you are a hetero, cisgender, white male, everything that is standardized is designed for you to be successful. And when you go into it recognizing that, you start to look at things like how, and that's why with Alice mentioned even the geometry thing, where if you really start to look at the language, especially in word problems, the way it's presented, you will see those things because what is culturally normalized for those. So my whole thing with that is privilege is it's not an interrogation on you. It's recognize what privileges you do have, recognize that others don't have those, and how might you be more informed so that when you are engaging in a learning experience, of speaking, whatever it is, that you can be more inclusive of more of your audience, and acknowledge that we all benefit from some type of privilege.
Yeah, absolutely.
It doesn't make you a bad person.
Right.
Well, I want to ask our guests. Well, first of all, I want to thank each of you for being here, Holly, Ken, and Alice. It's incredible to have had you on our broadcast tonight. And like Victoria said, you are welcome back anytime. Alice, thank you for allowing us to use your platform. We definitely got a lot more interaction and people saying that they're really listening and learning. And for all the people viewing, whether it's live or in the replay, there are so many things that you can do that don't cost money. You don't have to read a book. You don't have to watch a documentary. There are things you can do at home, things you can Google, so you don't have to bother people or be offensive. I mean, you don't have to spend money doing this. You just have to spend time and really do it. And then we will definitely have more broadcasts coming. We're not sure what's next, but we want to thank everybody so much for joining us tonight. But Holly, Ken, and Alice, before we go, I always ask our guests, are there any last words that you want to leave with us before we say goodnight?
Yeah, I'm going to quote one of my favorites. It's in one of my keynotes, Nipsey Hussle. If you look at the people in your circle and you don't get inspired, you don't have a circle, you have a cage.
Yep.
That's so true.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. I want to go off of what Ken, y'all are dropping all these good nuggets in the private chat, but I do think it's important just to highlight once more, and we've said this a couple of times, it's not the duty of a person of color to educate you, right? So if you want to ask for a trusted resource, or if you have a question, don't necessarily always expect a response back. Make sure that you do your due diligence on your own to research and grow and just kind of track out what that journey means for you. Because baby steps are still steps, but nobody is entitled to tell you anything. So just don't expect that when you are communicating with folks.
Right. And that's why the Google is so important. Like you don't have to, Google it. It's all there. Ken, I have to say about a year and a half ago, maybe almost 2 years ago, you dropped spiritual bypass into my one of my Facebook posts, and I loved it. Like I can't tell you, that was like my whole culture was being spiritually bypassed, and it wasn't just about race; it was about literally everything. So I love that you mentioned that at the beginning. But you can Google that. You can Google things. You can Google people. You can Google ideas that you don't understand. Google is your friend. We're all in EdTech, so it's there.
Yes. And I dropped a resource. I mean, it's quite comprehensive. They've got resources for adults, resources for educators, resources for kids, resources for violence, children's books, social emotional development. So if you want to push that out, you're more than welcome to. But I found this to be a gold mine when I'm working with folks and they're like, where do I go? But they don't necessarily want to offload the labor on me. This is a great place for them to start and explore.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
All right, Holly, was there anything that you wanted to add? I don't want to put you on the spot, but I also don't want to cut you off. So, all right. Well, thank you again, everybody. We will see you next time. Take care and be good to one another. Goodbye.